Having listened this morning to the first keynote, I've been so impressed by what was said there. I can say I'm now going to give you something completely different. Yesterday, we heard several speakers arguing that we need to do things differently, from rewiring social media recommendation systems to removing the super rich elites. But we didn't hear much about how to achieve these objectives in practice. Today, I'm going to talk about policymaking, that is the way that governments set the parameters of our lives. But to lower your expectations, I'm not going to show you how to solve the climate crisis or get rid of oligarchs. I'm going to focus not on the big issues, but on the little ones. My talk is based on my own experience, which is mainly with United Kingdom policymaking. In the questions afterwards, I'd be really interested to hear whether what I say applies in your country or how it's different, since policymaking does vary considerably in different states. Anyway, if I can make this work, then what else can I do apart from press the button? Right. Right. Okay. I want to start off with a little personal story. You might or might not remember the financial crisis of 2008. And at that time, one of the things that happened was that that housing throughout the world, but especially in Europe, certainly, and in the United States, went through a crisis that as well. It became extremely difficult to borrow the money to buy a new house, and the price of ordinary homes went down rather than up as they had been. And so it occurred to us that it would be useful to build a computer model of the housing market. And this is a screenshot of the model in its earliest incarnation. This is an agent-based model in which the agents are households, and they buy and sell their homes. It's quite a complicated model because it tries to follow the way, the way in which actual homes are bought and sold. For example, if you want to sell your house and buy another, you have to find somebody to buy your house before you can move into the new one. What's called a housing chain, and often those chains collapse so that nobody actually moves. Anyway, what we did is we had this kind of abstract town, which is the spotty thing you can see in the middle. We had estate agents, or realtors as they call them in the States, who were there to value houses based on what they were, on houses that had recently been sold in the area, and so on. And we were able to show the effect of things like interest rate changes and the significant change in the financial crisis of 2008, which was that banks stopped lending the whole of the value of a house and would only lend you, say, 60% of the house value. We were able to show, what the effect of this had on the housing market as a whole. So essentially what we were doing was we were modeling individual actions, buying and selling houses, in order to understand a macro effect, which is the housing market as a whole. Well, we were very proud of our little model, and we took it to the government department that was concerned with regulating the housing market, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government in the centre of London. And I took it to the people, the civil servants who were in charge of looking after the housing market and policy making in that relation. And I presented it to them. And I asked them also, well, to start off with, I asked them, what do you do about understanding the housing market? And, well, to cut a long story short, they basically said, we have a spreadsheet. What they did with the spreadsheet was to extrapolate from what the market had, how the market had been growing, changing, to what they assumed was going to happen in the future. It was a quite complicated spreadsheet. It was essentially an econometric model that took various parameters of the housing market and used that in a regression to understand the future. Thing is that actually it didn't work very well, it turned out. That graph there shows you what actually happened in 2008. It wasn't exactly a straight line or easy to predict from an econometric model. Well, I thought that my agent-based model was much better than that because I could anticipate these kinds of major macro changes. However, civil servants said, well, Professor Gilbert, it's very interesting what you've told us, but if your model gives us the same results as our model, our spreadsheet, then, well, there's not much point in using your model. And if it gives different results, well, how do we know that your model is correct? This is what I call the modeler's catch-22. If your model doesn't conform to expectations, then it's wrong. And if it does conform to expectations, then it's pointless. And this negative reaction to my clever little model has informed me thereafter about the relationship between modeling and complexity, in fact, as we shall see, and policy making. So I want to spend much of the rest of my talk exploring those issues, and I'll come back to at the end to talking about how one overcomes the modeler's catch-22. As I say, I'm going to be talking about public policy, but I'm not going to be talking about the grand public policy. I'm not going to be talking about dealing with the war between the US and Iran. I'm not going to be talking about Ukraine. I'm not going to be talking about climate crisis. I'm going to be talking about is the little things that occupies the policymakers for the most part. In the UK, we have not just laws, which are the sort of big things passed in Parliament, but also statutory regulations. I show on the screen a random bit of statutory regulation to give you an idea. This is about vaping, and just to give you an idea of the scale, there are about 10 statutory regulations published every day by the government. And these regulations then are the things that actually make a difference, for the most part, to how we live our lives. So it's that sort of level of public policy that I'm going to be essentially concerned with. And this public policy or policy making takes place at a number of different levels. Obviously, Parliament, government, ministers, and members of Parliament in the UK and the equivalents in other countries set out essentially the overall strategy. That overall strategy is filled in by ministries. There'll be ministries of, well, you just saw the Ministry of Housing, for example. There'll be finance ministries, labour ministries, environment ministries, and so on and so forth. And they make the policy, the statutory instruments, and formulate the acts of Parliament. But the implementation of all of that is done, at least in the UK, by what we call delivery bodies, which are part of public administration, but they're not the actual ministries, not the policy makers, but the people who put things, actually get things done, as it were. And the people who actually get the things done on the ground are called, in the jargon, street-level bureaucrats. They're the people, the policemen, the environmental inspectors, the care workers, and so on, who do the work. And all of those 4 levels are important in actually working out what policy is. Obviously, Parliament, but at the other end of the scale, the people on the ground, the policemen and so on, they are the people who have to work out how to apply the regulation to the specific case that they have, as it were, in front of them. So all of those things, all of those levels are important in policy making. You can begin to see where complexity might come in. We have this kind of multi-level arrangement. Well, I'm going to argue that public policy is complex. I guess you might have guessed that, given where we are. One of the things that I'm going to suggest, however, is that most policymakers don't yet know that. One of our jobs is to help them realize this. So just to reinforce the idea that public policy is complex, I want to go through some of the standard characteristics of complex systems and just apply them to a number of examples of policy. Well, as we all know, complex systems are typically open systems. And one of the ways in which we can see that is that markets are full of all kinds, are essentially subject to a vast range of factors, not just simple supply and demand. More or less at random, I have found this example of the price of cocoa, which, as you can see, shot up in 2024, partly as a result of climate change and partly as a result of geopolitical trends, effects. And all of that, so cocoa as an example, and the price of cocoa is something that is in an open system. I've already referred to the fact that policy making is multi-scale. Emergence is an important part. This example is a map of a part of Switzerland, which shows the installation of solar panels on people's rooftops. And the point here is that it's not in any sense a random arrangement, that there is now a lot of evidence to show that the most important influence, or one of the most important influences on whether you decide to install photovoltaic or solar panels on your roof, is whether your friends and family have, and whether your neighbours have. So it's a geographical emergent effect. Policy systems are nested. Here is a map, if you like, of the UK's ministries, and I referred earlier to delivery bodies, or sometimes they're called arm's length bodies, and though the green blobs here are the ministries, and the rest of them are various kinds of committees, advisory bodies, delivery bodies. And the point I want to make here is that what we have is each, the links, I should say, are the formal relationships between these various organizations. And you'll see that each ministry is closely connected to a penumbra of advisory bodies and delivery bodies and so on, but very much less connected to the other ministries. So we have a system of governance here where each ministry is essentially concerned with their own their own topics, their own domain, but only very weakly with other ministries. Again, in the jargon, we call this a siloed government, that each ministry is in its own silo and talks rather little to others. And there are good reasons for this. Government is extremely complex. Policy making is very complicated. And that policymakers have a limited amount of bandwidth to understand the policy domain. So it's much easier to talk to your colleagues in the same office building than it is to talk to people who perhaps have something to say, but are in a different ministry, in a different building. Let me tell you a quick story about that. We were working with the UK's department called DEFRA, which stands for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. One of the things that it's concerned with is farming and encouraging farmers, for example, to be more environmentally friendly when they're doing their farming, their agriculture. And they were putting together a scheme that was, I'm simplifying rather a lot, aimed at subsidizing or funding farmers for doing things like growing wide hedges so that butterflies and insects and other animals could grow in the hedges, And so they put together this scheme, and they decided that the way that farmers would have to apply would be using an online web form. It's nowadays a perfectly reasonable thing to ask people to apply for funding. The trouble was that they hadn't sort of thought through that the farmers that they were aiming for, intended applicants, were farming in rural areas where broadband and internet was only intermittently available and was very slow. And why hadn't they thought this through? It's kind of obvious now I say it. That was because broadband, the rollout of broadband in the UK, was the concern of a different ministry. And there was essentially no connection between the two. We pointed this out to them and they made the connection, so we made a small difference there. Complex systems, we expect non-linearities. Going back to solar system, PV, again, this is, I think, a rather spectacular graph of the number of solar installations in the world. And it's a beautiful exponential, as you can see. Partly because there's a feedback loop here that as more solar is installed, it gets cheaper, and as it gets cheaper, it becomes more worthwhile to install more solar. And policy is path dependent. What you can do now depends on the decisions that you made before. Here's another nice example of the difference between domestic heating in Sweden and in the United Kingdom. 1973, going back again in history, there was, as you may remember, an oil crisis, a bit like the oil crisis now, actually. The price of oil shot up, and the response throughout the world was to deal with this by diversifying energy sources. Sweden chose to do this by installing hydropower, and starting at building nuclear power stations, burning wood, biomass. But this was quite expensive, and so the result of that was that there was a great encouragement by the government to install insulation in homes and also to set up heat networks where you have one boiler for a whole district and then pipe hot water to the various homes. In the UK, the situation was also required diversification, but they did it in a very different way because there was natural gas available in the North Sea. So what happened was that the whole of the households' heating was converted from coal and oil to using natural gas. Something like 80% of the UK homes now are heated by natural gas. And that was relatively cheap, and so in comparison, little attention was paid to insulation or indeed to heating efficiency. There were almost no heat networks in the UK. In both cases, everything was fine until such time as we got climate climate change. People started worrying about climate change until the recent oil crisis, which also increased the price of gas. In retrospect, I think we'd all agree that the Swedish policy was the right policy and the UK policy was the wrong one. But that's with the power of looking back. It was not an obvious policy decision at the time in the 1970s. But the consequence is that the two countries have a very different policy-making scene when it comes to dealing with domestic energy. And complex systems are adaptive. Here's another little story for you to illustrate the perils of policy making when we have adaptive an adaptive population. In 1990, no, 2000s, in fact, there was an effort to switch businesses from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. And there was a scheme set up that subsidized, or in fact paid businesses to convert from oil boilers to using wooden pellets, renewable biomass. Now, what I think the policymakers had not quite worked out was that the rate that was paid to businesses for using this biomass was actually 60% more than the cost of the biomass. So it was certainly going to encourage them to make the conversion. In fact, it was so much encouraging that some bright people started using biomass to heat up empty barns, because they were making money by using up the renewable pellets. And so we got a situation where farmers and others were installing these burners to heat just empty property and raking in the cash. Consequently, the amount of money that the government was spending shot up way over budget. This, in fact, was in Northern Ireland rather than generally in the UK. And the consequences of this policy-making mistake, because a mistake in the sense that people adapted to the new policy, was actually very serious, not just for the climate, but also for the government. It, in fact, led to the collapse of the Northern Ireland government and the dissolution of the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is the Northern Ireland government. And for other political reasons, that assembly didn't meet again for another 3 years. So-called cash for ash scandal. And then, well, I couldn't resist this self-organization. It's a lovely video of cars that were driven. The drivers of these cars were just asked to drive around in a circle, following the car in front. There were no obstructions. It's a plain field. And as you can see, you end up with a classic traffic jam, just like you get on the motorways that go round Paris and the motorway that goes round London. So-called phantom traffic jams caused by nothing at all. Self-organization of a kind that we probably don't want. I'd just like to mention this rather nice poster which is freely available and which you might find nice to stick on your wall. I've put the QR code there. It was produced as part of the work of the centre that I run. The centre is called CCAN, which is an abbreviation for a rather impossible name. The full name of the centre is the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. So that visual representation of complexity is available for you if you want. Okay, well, I think I've probably shown you that complexity has something to do with policy making. Let's move on to how we might deal with that complexity. One of the aspects of complex systems is that they are changeable, that things change, they're dynamic. The kind of I've borrowed this illustration, in fact, not from policy making, but from software engineering, because there are some similarities, and I shall explain. And the traditional way of engineering large systems was shown on the right-hand side of this diagram. What's called the waterfall. You start off by working out what your requirements are. What is this system, this software system, supposed to do? Design the system. You then start coding it, you implement it, try it out, you verify that what your program does, your code does, actually fits with the requirements that you started off with. And then there's a period of maintenance as things change. This is the classic way of building large, complicated software systems. And it is also, to some extent, the way in which traditional policy making is done. You have a policy, you have, first of all, some policy aims. What are the objectives of this policy? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to encourage people to use renewable energy? Are you trying to stop people vaping in the streets or whatever? Design your policy, you implement it through your delivery bodies, you evaluate the success of that policy, and you may sort of tweak it at the edges as things change. The trouble is that both in software engineering and in policy making, this is often a pretty bad way of doing policy. Why is it bad? Because the world is changing around you. As going back to what I said about open systems, the requirements in both the software engineering case and the policy making case may well have completely changed by the time you've got down to the verification. Indeed, not only may they completely have changed, but actually the people who are defining the requirements may not even know what they want. Only when they've found that when you've implemented the software or you've implemented the policy that they realise that actually it wasn't what they wanted. It wasn't what they thought they wanted at all. Now, in software engineering, the solution to this problem, as it were, is what's called agile development or agile methodology. Instead of starting at the top with requirements and then working one's way down to maintenance, what we do in agile development is we go around that loop that's on the left-hand side as fast as possible. And And that means in software engineering terms, sometimes very fast indeed, like a week rather than the months or even years typical of building large software engineering projects in the waterfall method. And if you think about the sort of things like Facebook or social media programs that we use, they're all built nowadays using an agile methodology. In policy making, the penny hasn't quite dropped yet. I think there are certainly efforts, at least in the UK system, to be more agile about policy making. But we're a long way from it yet. Typically, major policy takes literally years to formulate and get accepted. Another thing that becomes important, I think, to realize when one's thinking about complex policy, and again, it comes back to being multi-scale and open and so on, is that the ministry, the policymaker, is not the sole repository of knowledge. That a wide variety of so-called stakeholders hold knowledge that is important to bring into the equation in policy making. I think a classic example of failure to bring in stakeholder knowledge in the UK was a policy called the Green Deal. Green Deal was a scheme that would reward householders for installing insulation, loft insulation, and heat pumps and things of that kind. And it was announced to great fanfare in 2013. The idea, a lot of money was put behind it. That there was a budget of millions, tens of millions, and the government sort of sat back and said, right, now we're expecting to insulate our poorly insulated homes in the UK. You remember I told you earlier that UK had done very little about making its homes well insulated. Trouble was that the policymakers failed to think through failed to consult with the necessary people, with the people who are actually involved, not just with a cross-section of householders, but also with the people who are making the heat pumps, the people who are installing the heat pumps, the suppliers of insulation, the electricity generators and distributors, and so on. And with the banks, with the finance that was required. And the consequence was that instead of millions of people taking up this idea, they actually got it. They got 14,000 households to apply for this Green Deal and actually succeed in having a classic case of building a policy insulated in your own bubble, and not thinking about this as a complex system which involves a whole series of different factors and links and causes. One way of dealing with that is to start thinking about policy making, its effects on people. Now, our one methodology that we're trying to pursue in this is the use of what we call personas. personas are basically virtual people, and we give them characteristics and then explore how they might react to the policy that is being proposed. Personas give policymakers a chance to imagine what the reactions of people might be to their policies. We try and set up personas that extend over the whole range of those affected by policies. And then I suppose this is in a way related to the comments I made about agility in policy making. We also are trying to get policymakers to think about evaluating what they're doing in a developmental kind of way. What that means is to say that instead of implementing a policy, then trying to work out whether or not it works using the so-called summative evaluation. It's a bit like teaching somebody at a university, and then at the end of the 3 years or whatever, you give them a final examination. You say, are you any good? What's your degree level? Instead, evaluating the policy and the implementation as you go along, and changing it as you go along, learning as you're in the process of doing. So when I mentioned earlier about the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity, one of the ways in which that centre is trying to move forward with policy making is to promote the idea that evaluation should be developmental evaluation. And then also related to that is, and related to many of the things I've already said, is the idea that policy making should be about a whole system, not just the little bit of policy area that is the kind of obvious bit, but the whole system as widely constructed as possible. Its actual diagram on the screen is quite early and quite famous, I think, so-called system map, which maps the relationships between factors that are thought to affect obesity. How fat people are, if you like. This was important because in policy making, because there had been a tendency to make policies specifically about, for example, banning high-fat, high-sugar food, or trying to restrict its advertising. So focusing very narrowly on the availability of certain sorts of food. But this diagram indicates rather clearly there's much more to the obesity epidemic than just the availability of certain sorts of ultra-processed food. That we have to think about all of these different areas. And then I think finally, thinking about the idea of scenarios is also an important way of dealing with complexity. This is the idea of scenarios, is that we should look, not trying to predict the future. This goes back to what was being said yesterday. Not trying to predict the future, because in a complex system, we're unlikely to be able to make predictions with any degree of certainty in most situations, but rather to see what the future possibilities are. And one way of doing that is to think about a variety of possible scenarios. This is a scenario that's being used in energy policy in the UK nowadays in terms of what would happen if we decentralized or centralized the supply of energy, and if we either encouraged and sped up decarbonization or did it less effectively. And one of the things that, excuse me, this kind of scenario analysis can show you is, well, two things. One is it can show you the things that are very unlikely to happen. We can't predict what will happen, but we can predict in some circumstances what is very improbable. And the second thing that we can think about is what's called minimizing regrets. In other words, what are the policies that will work regardless of which scenario we end up with? Won't give us a real problem regardless of what scenario we end up with. Think back to Sweden and the UK. When we converted UK households to natural gas, we didn't think about the possibility that maybe natural gas wasn't such a wonderful idea. The minimizing regrets or maximizing the possibilities of managing in different scenarios. So I've suggested some of the ways in which policy making could be done better if we recognized that policy is working in a complex environment. The natural question then is, oh, okay, this all sounds really wonderful. Why aren't we already doing it? Well, I think there are some very good reasons, and reasons that we need to think about if we're thinking about improving policy making to take account of complexity. Or we need to recognize that policy professionals, policy makers, are people who are following careers that they individually want to do well, that as a consequence of that, often they are risk averse. The culture of government, of policy making, is often one where getting things wrong is much worse than getting things right. You get a pat on the back if you get it right. You get fired if you get it wrong. Another thing about policy making is that it tends to work on short-term cycles. The government is only in power for so long. There's an election coming, or there's a crisis come up in the newspaper. The minister wants an answer in 12 hours' time, not in 12 years' time. In the UK, I don't know how widespread this is, but typically senior policy professionals change their role every 18 to 24 months. So it's very difficult for them to pursue a policy-making process that takes longer than that. Generalists, again, in the UK, tend to be of higher status than specialists. And so that a policymaker will often have a rather shallow knowledge of a particular domain. And when it comes to consulting stakeholders, I find that policymakers are fearful of the outside world, fearful of being lobbied by people with special interests. And they tend to, as a result, to kind of retreat inside their ministry. Be interested to know to what extent these characteristics are specific to the UK. Another issue is that policy making follows a particular time frame, as I've already indicated a number of times, and time is a much neglected but really important part of the notion of policy making. As I suggested just a moment or two ago, governments have electoral cycles, companies have financial years, people have, lifetimes, schools have terms and so on, children have bedtimes and wake times. These are all natural cycles. And if you're going to have an effect on policy, on the world, you need to think quite closely about not just what's happening, but when it happens, how it links in with these what are called chronotypes, the inherent temporal rhythms of life. And if you don't get it right, then policies can fail or get abandoned. So as governments have cycles, and ministers have cycles, and they also have careers. So that ministers need to make an impression. They need to have visible policies that the things that ought to be get done, but happen in the background. For example, again in the UK, we have a complex software infrastructure, as in governments generally. It collects data that issues, that administers the system. That software needs maintenance. Runs on computers that are become obsolete. New technology comes in. The trouble is that a minister that comes in and says, I think we ought to have more efficient, more effective, and more modern software and information technology, is not going to win an election on that. It may be really important as a background, but it's really difficult to get that kind of that kind of background policy up to the front of an agenda and a budget for it. Okay, so life as a minister is really difficult for all the reasons that I've listed there. So those are the kinds of problems that we need to face. Those are the kinds of we can't just breeze in and say, oh, well, you should be making policy in a very different kind of way. Get on with it. You have to be a lot more subtle than that. And what I want to suggest is some of the ways in which we, and I say we, I mean by that scientists, researchers, academics, scholars, can help with policy making. I showed you the obesity system map earlier. And what we have been doing, that is CCAN have been doing, is helping government departments with policymakers develop system maps of their domains. It works because it helps them expand their vision, helps them get out of their silos. That anecdote I told you about broadband and the farming subsidies, actually that anecdote came out of an effort with the relevant ministry, DEFRA, to do a system map of the food system that they were policy making of. So we have a methodology which we call participatory system mapping. And we have software, in fact, which helps with that. Participatory system mapping involves getting a bunch of policymakers and stakeholders together, either remotely, online, or in a room together, and getting them to develop a system map in a participatory, in a co-design kind of way. And we have some software that makes that easy to do, called Prism. You can the website there is on the slide. It's free. It runs in your web browser, and I can go on about it forever, but I won't. Another way in which we can, and a related way in which we can encourage policymakers, is to move them towards what I call whole system ownership. And in fact, that's already been the case. That movement has already been started, both in the European Union and in the UK, with a movement towards what's called mission-driven government rather than ministry-organized government. The idea of mission-driven government is to say that there are some major issues, major problems that don't fit neatly into boxes, like the way in which government is currently divided. We want to break down traditional government silos or divisions, and set up new relationships. And that kind of idea is gaining ground, and I think we can help, and there are academics, scholars who are doing it. I'm getting towards the end. Yeah, I am nearly there. Something that we are developing that is really, I think, interesting. It takes on ideas from cybersecurity. The idea that if we can do red teaming on policy. What red teaming means is that we try and find the holes in the policy before it's actually fully designed and implemented. This is something that scholars and scientists can really contribute to. Policy, getting in at an early stage in policy making, identifying the risks that policymakers haven't thought. Creating plausible scenarios, helping them create those sorts of scenarios that I was talking about. So, opportunities to make a difference, I should say, to policy making. We can provide external perspectives, bridge silos, demonstrate how to manage complexity, and develop complexity-aware narratives and scenarios. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that we can have an interesting discussion about whether any of those ideas works from where you're standing.